Welcome Internet to Psychoanalytic Talk, and today we're going to be talking about psychotherapeutic regression, which is a topic that was developed by Winnicott and later on expanded upon by Christopher Bollas. And this is the two main authors I'm going to be using in this video. So before we begin with these authors, I need to go back to the basics. You should know that Freud also conceptualized a regression. However, his was not exactly a regression in psychotherapy, but a regression as a process. Mainly a process that happens at nighttime during dream phases, in which people go back to previous states of mind, previous affects. The mind regresses, i.e. goes back to something that was once true, but the person has moved on or built defenses upon it. That it's not basically the conscious mind, but it's going back, regressing into the unconscious mind. It's a very interesting concept in of itself, but this is not what I'm going to be focusing on today's video. Today we're going to be talking about the regression as it occurs in psychotherapy. So for this, we're going to talk about the concept itself. In psychodynamic psychotherapy and in other forms of psychotherapy, the patient is invited to look within, to have introspection, to understand their past. Often that understanding is basically merged with the good therapeutic relationship with the therapist, which allows the patient to go back mentally to states of mind which they had repressed, suppressed, or even completely abandoned, and that all they were fighting against. This regression basically implies that the patient is going to go back to a previous state. One of the main authors that really developed this very well is Winnicott, and mainly with his concept of false self, i.e. that, for example, when something has gone wrong in the relationship with the caregivers, when the caregivers were not able to provide affection or love, or wanted to format the individual, the infant, they basically provided a structure in which the child had no choice but to basically merge with, a structure that was false, but that they had to basically be involved with if they wanted to survive and gain affection. That structure that the individual merges with but isn't quite them is what Winnicott called the false self. It's a sort of personality that isn't quite the individual, that it encapsulates the true self. So that false self is both basically a way of survival, but it also in time it basically shadows the true self, and in extreme cases it might even override the true self. So for Winnicott, this concept of false self basically is going to create another personality that's not going to be what the person truly is. This dichotomy between feelings of being oneself and of having to play a role is very deep, and it causes immense suffering. And one of the solutions, according to Winnicott, is to allow the patient and to provide the context in psychotherapy for the patient to be able to regress, i.e. go back to that true self in the fact of being dependent upon someone, i.e. going back to a state of mind in which someone is going to take care of them, is going to love them and care for them as a caregiver should have done. This regression basically is a fundamental aspect to healing the false self, because the false self is a barrier, something that's there because it cannot be otherwise, or at least in the subjectivity of the individual, it can't be altered, that they have to adapt constantly. So therefore, to undo that constant adaptation, the individual needs to be able to go back to a state in which they can trust and the other take care of them. And for Winnicott, this is incredibly important, and the whole work of therapy is to provide these people with the care that they need. So Winnicott himself did really act upon his theory, that for some patients he would even go home to their home and cook meals for them, and basically he would really take care of them as a mother would. So this form of regression was theorized by Winnicott as being essential for dealing with a false self. And this is where it's going to be very interesting, because Christopher Bollas is going to come in into the 80s and explain that although Winnicott was completely right in the fact that some regressions can be very intense, very profound, very ultimate, that basically they're not always like that. And he says that the problem with Winnicott's version of regression isn't that it's wrong, is that it has made psychotherapists afraid of it. Because when you have, for example, like say, I don't know, 20, 30 patients, you might not be able to dedicate, let's say, a whole afternoon for just one patient. But Christopher Bollas explains that sometimes it's not as consuming as that, that sometimes regression is more subtle, more nuanced than what Winnicott presented, and that Winnicott's version of regression is more for extreme situations and for people who have had a severe adaptation in false self. For Bollas, these regressions can be sometimes very subtle. It can be like, for example, reading something like a childhood book, or basically playing or having affection for old toys, things like that, that are much more manageable in the basically in the lives of everyone. It's not some dramatic and absolute breakdown, but something of a subtle like moment of nostalgia. And it still gives good results. It still can help the patient let go of layers of their false selves. So very fundamentally, I found that both versions of regression are very interesting and very important. I will say that both are true. That the more extreme one, and Bollas is right, scares a lot of people because they're afraid of losing themselves. For the patients and for the therapist is this fear of, what am I going to do? I can't be their mothers, right? However, I would say that in most cases, it's not necessarily about the extreme adaptation of the therapist towards the patient, but being able to adapt, to even slightly change things. For example, to instead of seeing the patient, let's say, once a week, you see them 2 times, 3 times a week, perhaps not for an hour, but for 2 hours each time. Perhaps sometimes you basically give advice when normally you wouldn't, and so on and so forth. I think that in these cases of, let's say, intense regression, it's not necessarily about what you're gonna do in the real world that necessarily matters, but how you adapt. And I think that a lot of people and a lot of therapists can adapt without compromising themselves, without creating alienation between them and the patient. Because as Winnicott's experience is, I think, honestly, personally, very brave of him to have adapted to that extent to a patient, I don't think it should be considered a fundamental rule, i.e. not every psychotherapist should adapt to that level. Not because some people don't need it, because I do think certain people absolutely need that type of help, but because fundamentally it creates a dynamic in which there perhaps is massive resentment on both sides. There's a resentment of the therapist to have to take care of the patient, but there's also a resentment of the patient towards the therapist because they feel that the therapist has put them in this position. In these cases of very, very intense regression, I would say that hospitalization, or at least having a third party involved, is very, very important, because fundamentally the patient is reliving something, and this is important for them to re-experience and to be able to understand that someone is there for them. That being there for them, however, varies from patient to patient. I don't think there's like one unilateral way of doing it. And I also think that the abilities of the patient are also quite determinant in these forms of regression. And that basically, if it's so intense, there needs to be an institutional care. So institutional care is one of those dodgy explanations, because I don't want you to understand this as the therapist can cop out, because that's not what it's about. The therapist still needs to adapt, and that I am very adamant about. However, I do think that in certain cases, only a pluridisciplinary team of nurses, educators, assistants, and so on and so forth, doctors, we can go on this, needs to be there for one patient. The institution itself playing the role of the caregiver. And in these cases, I think that the institution can do perhaps a better job than just one individual. And I do profoundly believe that as a therapist that both basically works in private practice and in an institution, I think that the institution provides much more leeway for these types of intense regressions. Then let's move on to the idea of Christopher Bollas, which I also agree with, because not everyone is going to regress to that level. A, because not everyone needs it, and B, some patients only need to fix certain adaptations that they had that they are unhappy with. They don't need to go back and through layers and layers and layers of false self. They only need a slight adaptation, and this can be very, very as slight as just showing the therapist childhood photos, right? It's not anything that's really, how can I say, destroying, time-consuming, and so on and so forth. In these cases, what is very interesting is that Bollas is presenting it as just something normal, something natural, and something we shouldn't be afraid of. And that framing, I think, is very important, because it's true that when, for example, you're presented with Winnicott's version of regression, you start to wonder, am I capable of doing that? Am I able to? Should I even do it? All these questions that are very important, but sound sometimes like a fatality in Winnicott's examples, should not be considered like that. Regression doesn't always need to go that far, and when it does, you're not alone. You can sometimes get the help of families or of institutions, as I was saying earlier. And in the case of mild regressions, they provide wonderful reconnections internally from a feeling of being lost to a feeling of meaning, or the feeling that something has been rekindled in one's mind. And this can be a formidable ally in psychotherapy. And I completely agree with Bollas. In regards to this intense regression that I was talking about, a la Winnicott, right? So this intense regression also can provide very good results in psychotherapy. However, it needs to be experienced, it needs to be lived. And I do believe that. I don't believe that regression, when the setting is good enough, when the patient is ready, when the therapist is ready, when basically all lights are green, I think it should happen. I think it should never be avoided for the sake of being avoided. It should only be avoided if, for example, the patient feels that they're not ready to let go of their defenses, or when there isn't the material space to be able to do so. There's a lot of nuance to this discussion, and I absolutely do not want to say it always has to happen all the time, every time. However, I don't think it should be avoided because it's a massive return to a prior state. I think quite the opposite. If it's possible, it should be tried, because people do need to go back in themselves and rekindle the link with their lost true self. And this is so essential in so many different situations. I'm not even talking about psychopathologies here. I'm really talking about just how a lot of people can be overwhelmed, can have had to adapt so quickly and so thoroughly that they are unable to basically be in touch with themselves. This creates a life in which they live in, but not for them. And this creates a deep fracture in who they are. And therefore regression can heal this fracture. And that's why it's so important in psychotherapy. And it shouldn't be feared, it should be welcomed. And I think that this is one of the most important aspects that Bollas basically adds to Winnicott's theory. It is not always as complex and hard, and the therapist should not fear it inherently. Now, I hope you like this video. If you, of course, have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.